Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to be looking into the Golan Heights.
Oh, yeah.
It's a really tense situation brewing over there.
Mhm.
It's been a conflict zone between Israel and Syria for, I mean, it feels like forever.
For decades, yeah.
Yeah, for decades. And you sent over some recent news, and I gotta say, some of these headlines are pretty alarming.
Yeah, no, you're right. The situation is particularly volatile right now.
Yeah.
Israel's recent actions have really ratcheted up the tension in the region.
So let's start with this Israel's decision to take control of the demilitarized zone in the Golan Heights.
Right.
250 square kilometers we're talking about here. What's the story here, and why is this such a big deal?
Well, to understand the significance, you need to understand what a demilitarized zone is
Okay.
and its purpose in this context.
Right.
Essentially, it's a buffer zone created by agreement between warring parties where military presence is prohibited.
Makes sense.
It's meant to reduce the risk of accidental clashes
Mm-hmm.
and, create a space for potential negotiations.
Right.
In the Golan Heights, this zone has been in place since the aftermath of the 1973 Yom Kippur War,
Okay.
serving as a fragile but important symbol of restraint between Israel and Syria.
So by taking control of the zone, they're kind of ripping up that agreement.
Precisely, and they're justifying this by pointing to the instability in Syria.
Right.
With the Syrian government struggling to maintain control, Israel argues that the demilitarized zone is vulnerable to infiltration by hostile groups,
Yeah.
and they need to secure it to protect their own security.
But over 480 airstrikes in Syria within just 3 days, that's more than double the number for the whole of last year.
Right.
Doesn't that seem a little excessive?
It certainly raises questions about whether this is purely a defensive move or part of a larger strategy.
Right.
Some analysts believe Israel might be taking advantage of the chaos in Syria to further solidify its control over the Golan Heights,
Okay.
a territory they've occupied since the Six-Day War in 1967.
Yeah, hold on. Occupied since 1967. So even the part of the Golan Heights that Israel controls isn't technically theirs?
That's right. Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights has never been recognized by the international community.
Huh.
This move, along with their control of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, makes Israel one of the longest-running occupiers of territory in modern history, which, as you can imagine, fuels a lot of the conflict.
Okay, so we got this already disputed territory. Israel's making a power play, and Syria's basically in shambles. That's not a great recipe for peace, is it?
Not exactly, and to add another layer of complexity, there's the question of the people who actually live in the Golan Heights.
Right.
We're talking about a diverse population with unique challenges and perspectives that often get lost in the broader geopolitical narrative.
You're talking about the Druze community, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I was reading about them in the articles you sent. It sounds like they're caught in a real bind.
Absolutely. The Druze are a fascinating group
Yeah.
with a rich history and a distinct religious identity that sets them apart.
Okay.
We'll delve into that more in a bit, but what's really intriguing is their relationship with Israel. It's complicated, to say the least.
All right, let's dive into that. Who are the Druze, and how did they end up in this precarious position?
Well, the Druze are a religious group with roots in Islam, but their beliefs and practices differ significantly from both Sunni and Shia Islam.
Okay.
They have a long history in the Levant region, and their presence in the Golan Heights predates the modern conflict by centuries.
So they were already living there when Israel took control in 1967. What happened to them?
Unlike many Palestinians who were displaced during the conflict, a significant portion of the Druze community remained in the Golan Heights after it came under Israeli control.
Okay.
Today, they make up roughly half of the population on the Israeli side, alongside Jewish Israelis who have settled there since the war.
So you've got this mix of Druze who identify as Syrian and Jewish Israelis living in what's internationally considered occupied territory.
Right.
What's that dynamic like?
That's where it gets really interesting. Unlike other Arab populations living under Israeli control, the Druze in the Golan Heights have, for the most part, chosen to integrate into Israeli society.
Wow.
Many serve in the Israeli army, hold public office, and are active participants in various sectors of Israeli life.
Wow, so they're serving in the army of the country that occupies their land. That seems like a difficult position to be in.
It is, and it speaks to the complexity of their identity. They're essentially navigating two worlds simultaneously,
Yeah.
maintaining their Syrian cultural and familial ties while also engaging in Israeli society.
Right.
This creates a constant tension, a delicate balancing act that's further complicated by the recent escalation of the conflict.
So they're walking this tightrope,
Yeah.
pulled between these two sides.
Yeah, it's a very apt analogy, and with Israel asserting itself more forcibly in the Golan Heights, it's putting the Druze community in an increasingly difficult
All
position.
right.
They're facing pressure from both sides to choose loyalty to pick a side.
Yeah.
But for many Druze, it's not that simple.
Hmm.
Their identity is rooted in both Syria and the Golan Heights, a place they've called home for centuries.
What happens to their sense of belonging if Israel solidifies its control over the Golan Heights? Do they risk becoming strangers in their own land?
That's a question that weighs heavily on the Druze community, and it's something that Israel has to grapple with as well.
Yeah.
How they choose to treat the Druze population, particularly in the context of this escalating conflict, will send a strong signal not only to the Druze themselves, but to the wider Arab world.
You mentioned earlier that Israel sees the instability in Syria as a justification for their actions, but isn't there a risk that their actions could actually make the situation even worse? Could this spark a wider conflict?
It's a definite possibility, and that's where the role of regional powers like Iran comes into play.
Okay.
Iran has been a key ally of the Syrian government for years, providing both military and financial support. They view Israel as a major threat and have made it clear they won't tolerate any aggression against Syria.
So Israel's actions in the Golan Heights could be seen as poking the Iranian bear.
In a way, yes, and that's a dangerous game to play. Iran has considerable influence in the region, and they've shown a willingness to use force to protect their interests. Any escalation in the Golan Heights could easily draw Iran further into the conflict, potentially setting off a chain reaction with unpredictable consequences.
Okay, so we've got this incredibly tense situation with a lot of players and a lot of potential for things to go wrong. What about a diplomatic solution? Is there any hope for a negotiated settlement?
Well, historically, negotiations between Israel and Syria have been incredibly difficult, and the current situation makes it even more challenging with Syria in such a fragile state. It's unclear who would even represent them at the negotiating table. Plus, trust between the two sides is practically non-existent.
It's almost like they're speaking different languages, metaphorically speaking, with such deep mistrust and fundamentally different views on the future of the Golan Heights. Where do you even begin to find common ground?
That's the million-dollar question. And unfortunately, there's no easy answer. There's a lot of historical baggage, a lot of resentment on both sides, and to make matters worse, the involvement of external actors, each with their own agendas, further complicates the situation.
It feels like a tangled web. Every time someone tries to pull a thread, the whole thing gets tighter.
That's a good way to put it, and that's why it's so important to understand the complexities of this conflict. We can't just look at the recent headlines or the military maneuvers. We need to grasp the historical context, the competing interests, and most importantly, the human impact.
Right, like the Druze community, for example, they're not just pawns in this geopolitical chess game. These are real people with families, traditions, and a deep connection to their land, and their story is just one of many that often get overshadowed by the larger political narrative.
Absolutely, and that's what I find most compelling about this conflict, the human dimension behind the headlines, behind the political rhetoric. There are real people whose lives are profoundly affected by the decisions made by those in power. It's a reminder that conflicts like this are not just abstract geopolitical events.
Yeah.
They have a tangible impact on the lives of everyday people.
It's so easy to get caught up in the analysis of, power dynamics and strategic calculations that we forget about the individuals at the heart of it all.
Exactly, and I think that's something we need to constantly remind ourselves of as we delve into these complex issues. We need to approach them with empathy, with a recognition of the human cost of conflict.
So we've explored the recent escalation, the historical background, the involvement of regional powers, and the unique situation of the Druze community. It paints a pretty bleak picture, to be honest, but is there anything the international community can do to help de-escalate the situation? I mean, are there any levers they can pull to nudge things in a more peaceful direction?
It's a tough question
It is.
because this conflict has been going on for so long.
Yeah. There are so many layers, historical grievances, competing claims, shifting alliances.
Absolutely.
It feels like any attempt to step in could just backfire.
It's a delicate balance for sure.
Yeah.
And honestly, the track record of international intervention in the Middle East isn't exactly stellar,
Right.
but I do think there are a few things the international community can do,
Okay.
even if it doesn't, you know, lead to a sudden breakthrough.
What could they do? What kind of approaches could actually make a difference?
Well, first and foremost, there needs to be a clear condemnation of any actions that escalate the conflict.
Okay.
That means holding both sides accountable for any violations of international law or human rights abuses.
Right.
This might involve sanctions, diplomatic pressure, or even the threat of international prosecution.
So making it clear that there are consequences.
Right now, it seems like both Israel and Syria are operating with a sense of impunity.
Yeah.
They're making calculated moves, knowing that the international community is hesitant to intervene in such a complex and volatile situation.
Right.
But by establishing clear red lines and demonstrating a willingness to enforce them, it could create a deterrent effect and encourage both sides to think twice before taking actions that could spiral out of control.
That makes sense, but condemnation alone doesn't really solve the underlying issues, does it?
You're absolutely right.
You got to address the root causes of the conflict if you want any chance of lasting peace.
You're absolutely right. And that's where things get even more complicated.
Yeah.
Resolving the Golan Heights conflict requires tackling some incredibly thorny issues like the status of the occupied territories, the right of return to refugees, and the security concerns of both Israel and Syria.
It's like a giant Gordian knot, and no one can figure out how to untangle it.
Right.
You mentioned the human impact earlier. Maybe focusing on those stories, on those individual experiences,
Right.
could be a way to bridge the divide.
That's a really interesting point.
Mm.
You know, sometimes the grand political solutions seem so far out of reach that we forget about the power of human connection.
Yeah.
By amplifying the voices of those directly affected by the conflict.
Right.
The families divided,
Mm.
the communities displaced, the individuals caught in the crossfire.
Yeah.
It can help humanize the conflict and remind everyone that there are real people behind the headlines.
And maybe hearing those stories, those shared experiences of loss and resilience could plant the seeds for empathy, understanding, and eventually reconciliation.
I agree. It might not lead to an immediate solution, but it could create a shift in perspective,
Hmm.
a recognition of our shared humanity, even in the midst of conflict. After all, lasting peace isn't just about signing treaties. It's about building bridges of understanding and empathy.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening. We've gone from alarming headlines to unpacking decades of history, geopolitical tensions, and the human story is often forgotten in the grand scheme of things. It's left me with a lot to ponder and, frankly, a sense of urgency to stay informed and engaged with this incredibly complex issue.
I think that's the most important takeaway. Really, the Golan Heights conflict is far from resolved, and its implications extend far beyond the immediate region. By understanding the historical context, the competing narratives, and the human cost, we can all play a role in advocating for a more just and peaceful future for everyone involved.
Well said. As always, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going. We'll catch you on our next deep dive.